Let's look at one of my absolutely favourite types of spear and find out why it's different to most other spears. Hey folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria and Easton Antique Arms. Now, before we get to the spear, and it's a cool one, I hope you'll appreciate it, we're going to just mention some context, that's right, because I am known as Captain Context apparently. So, we have looked at various African weapons in the past, including the famous cascara. This is the sword made famous by the dervishes of the Sudan in the Sudan Wars, at least from a sort of British history perspective, of the 1880s. Now, you might not know anything about this period, so just very, very briefly, in the 1880s, Egypt became of great interest to Britain due to a threat to the Suez Canal. The Suez Canal was very important for trade with India. India was obviously very important to Britain's economy at this time. So we're talking about global politics here. Much like today, people went to war in far-reaching regions in order to secure their access to resources. So, Egypt was a troubled country in the 1880s, such that in 1882 Britain actually invaded it and ultimately turned it into a British protectorate. That's right, so it was still an independent country, but it was kind of part of the British Empire. Now, for quite some time, the Egyptians had a complex relationship, should we say, with the Sudan. Now, the Sudan is the area next to Egypt, kind of going down on the right-hand side, if you're looking at a map, and going downwards. And in fact, it goes a long way down. Sudan is actually huge. It's huge by European standards. And it contains many different groups of people, many different types of tribe, many different cultures, and many different weapons. So, in the area of the Sudan that was near to Egypt, nearer to Egypt, this is the archetypal type of sword that was being used by the people of that region. And I have looked at the cascara before. It was usually used incidentally with a shield, and we even have footage of people training with these things that was filmed in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And they still make these today, incidentally. Now, we've talked about the swords, now we're going to talk about the spears. So this particular spear, and I'm going to talk about some features of this spear which might be of interest to you, even if you're not particularly interested personally in Sudanese weapons or African weapons. In fact, there are some features of this weapon, and we're going to refer to some medieval weapons in comparison in a minute, which I think you'll find interesting. If you're interested in the development and evolution and use of weapons in general across history, anthropologically, or possibly even looking at it in a fantasy scenario if you're designing weapons for this sort of fictional universes. So, there were a wide variety of types of spears used in the Sudan, partly because the Sudan's huge, covers many, many different tribal groupings, and has lots of neighbouring countries all around which exert their own influences as well, and migrations of people backwards and forwards. So, by the time of the Sudan Wars of the 1880s, we end up with a wide variety of spears. Now, we're going to talk about this one, but before we do, we're going to talk about another one that we've got here, which is a massive headed one. And you'll notice this is on a much, much longer shaft. This is more typical spear length. It's taller than me. I'm 6 foot, so this is about, I don't know, 6'7". And it is a large head. Now, this is a type of spear which is famously from the Sudan. It's not to say that you don't find other massive headed spears, and you can see it's all pretty much as big as my face, pretty much. Not to say that you don't find other massive headed spears from other parts of the world, from other periods, and indeed other bits of Africa at this time. However, this particular type is a famous type of popularly used at this time Sudanese spear. Used by groups like the Beja Hadendawa, these sorts of people in the Sudan, and it is a very massive head. Now, I have actually made a video about these in the past, asking why would you make such a massive spearhead. So I won't cover that here, but it is it's almost paddle sized, isn't it? It's a bit like those paddle spears you get, which are made of wood usually, but this is made of iron. And quite well forged as well. It's got little hollow ground edges, a bit of a midrib, a bit of decorative filing work on the socket there. So that is one type of spear, and you will see that the next type of spear we're going to look at, the main one that this video is about, is really very different, completely different style of head. Almost certainly originally it's because these come from different tribal groupings. Now you could relate this to Bronze Age European history or Iron Age history, various peoples that the Romans came into contact with. It's very, very interesting how certain weapon forms are associated with certain tribal groupings, but because of wars that happen and you have to have confederations, if we look at Attila's Huns for example, there were many, many groups of people amongst Attila's Huns attacking Rome. Just the same, the Anglo-Saxons who invaded the British Isles in the 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th centuries, these people were actually a group of peoples, and they're widely quoted as being the Angles, the Jutes and the Saxons and the Frisians, but it almost certainly involved Franks and various other groups. And even within the Franks there were sub-tribal groupings, exactly the same in Africa, exactly the same throughout history across the world. The result is, when you get confederations of people, as happened in the 1880s under the forces of the Mahdi, who was the religious leader who brought together these essentially Islamic fundamentalist forces to fight against first Egypt and then Britain, and in fact other people, other nations, other African nations as well. Because he brought together lots of tribal groupings, you ended up with lots of different tribal weapons in one army. And that's what we see here. Now, as far as I know, we're actually lacking research on this. I don't think anybody has actually researched where this particularly characteristically big, flat style of spearhead comes from, which particular group, or indeed this type. But this is another very common type, and it is defined by having a more slender blade. I wouldn't call it a particularly slender blade. I've got a Zulu Assegai or Ikloa here, which is an even more slender blade, and you'll see in comparison it's actually not particularly, it's about the same kind of size and shape as a Zulu spear, but it's got this characteristic leaf shape, and they pretty much, this particular type, always do. They're quite kind of curvy, leaf-like. I think that's probably the best description for it. Leaf-like at the back, and then tapering to a fairly robust point. But one characteristic and a way of instantly recognizing these is they have this area either side of a midrib, which hopefully you can see, which you can see these hammer marks, but that is recessed. So it's essentially fullering. It's like fullering on a sword. It's hollow grinding. It's removing mass while keeping the rigidity and structural strength of the blade. And they have pretty simple socket, exactly like you'd find on most European spears of the Anglo-Saxon period all the way through. They are open, so they are not a closed socket. They are open split, much like some Anglo-Saxon spears are. So it's quite similar actually to an Anglo-Saxon spearhead. So there we go. But here's the main feature that I love. This is why you might be like, well, why is that different to any other spears? And yes, absolutely it's true. The main feature I love is actually at the back end, and it's this. Okay, so this is a coil of iron which has been forged around, wrapped around the back of the shaft to create essentially a pommel. I have another example here of that which I'll show in a second, but before I do, I'm just going to grab, well, let's grab the big old Sudanese spear. So fundamentally, spears are characterized by having usually a metallic head, a pointy head, and a wooden shaft, okay? And that's true of whether it's the ancient Greek, Roman, Egyptian worlds, whether it's the medieval, Renaissance, whatever, okay? Now that results in a certain sort of point of balance. You can adjust the point of balance by changing the weight of the head or changing the weight of the shaft, or, and I think a lot of people don't necessarily realize this, the weight distribution in the shaft. So a lot of polearm shafts are not parallel. They're not like you go to the hardware store and buy a dowel of wood. They're actually tapered, and they actually have some of them have their thickest points up here, some of them have the thickest points in the middle, and some of them the thickest at the back. Something like a bill shaft from the Mary Rose is incredibly thick up here and then tapers all the way down to the bottom. In fact, there's quite a bit of evidence that things like the Dane axe, I'll just disentangle the Dane axe here. Things like the Dane axe actually also very often had tapered shafts, and some surviving shafts that we have from Ireland, from bogs where the wooden shafts have survived, are thick at the top and taper down thinner, so the heads are actually slid on from the bottom end. So it can be constructional, but that does also mean that you've got even more hitting power at the top end because it's not a parallel shaft. You actually have more weight distributed to the top. Anyway, all of that to simply say that spears, generally speaking, how you use them is dictated partially by where their balance is, certainly if you're holding them in one hand. So if I'm fighting with a spear and a shield, there is only a certain way back that I can actually hold them without the top being so uncontrollable and so unwieldy that I just can't do that. I've got to move my hand closer to the point of balance in order to use it one-handed. This means that my real attacking reach is from there to there, and obviously I can only, whether I'm underhand or overhand, extend to a certain length, so I only have that much reach. Obviously, if you grip the thing two-handed, that changes the game, but let's not talk about that for a second because most of these are used with shields. So, the reason why I absolutely love this spear is because look how long it is. It only actually comes up to about the middle of my sternum, middle of my chest, okay? However, this spear, I can put my hand utterly at the back and I can stand there all day. It's practically like holding a rapier. And look at the reach of the thing. I mean, it's a longer reach, although it's a much, much shorter spear than this one, because it's got a lighter head and it's got the pommel, essentially, the counterweight at the back of the shaft. I actually have more reach with the shorter spear because I could literally happily use it all day long, holding it right at the back end, right by that pommel. It's incredibly effective, but I don't have to carry a massive spear. It's absolutely brilliant, and although it is longer than the typical Zulu Ikloa, sometimes known as an assegai, this is actually a longish one. You get shorter ones than this. Although it is longer than an assegai, not very much. It's still pretty small, pretty convenient to carry, and has enormous reach. Really, if I grab a rapier off the wall, really comparable, possibly even greater than a 45-inch blade rapier. That's crazy. And when you think of the technology of this is way simpler to make than a rapier. It's just a shaft of wood, a pretty simple iron spearhead. It doesn't need to be anything complex, and in fact, if anything, the lighter the better. And a wrap of iron at the back. You could use lead, you could use brass, you could use whatever, but a pommel at the back. And what I've now got is something which is way cheaper than a rapier or pretty much any other sword, and yet has equal thrusting range to the rapier. Yeah, it's not quite as nimble and I can't do some of the actions that a rapier can do. I'm not going to say it can do everything a rapier can do, but it can outreach a rapier while being, in literal terms, only a little bit longer and certainly a lot cheaper. And you can use it with a shield as well. So I mentioned I have another one here. I'm only going to show this one briefly because I'm actually doing some research on it because I've found some ambiguousness about its origin. It might be Sudanese, but it might not be. So this is when you take this concept to the absolute max. I have shown this on the channel many, many moons ago, but I wanted to go away and do some more research. I've done a bit, but I've kind of drawn a blank. So first of all, this is a massive head. You'll actually see it's hollow ground, so it's got an offset blade. It's quite interesting. Let's see if I can show this on camera. So it's forged inwards on this plane. Turn it around and it's the same there. So looking down the blade that way, it's like the blade does a zigzag, which means that you've reduced the weight. It's essentially hollow ground, but you've ended up with something quite similar to a sword blade. Very, very long, very big, for a spear anyway, partisan sized. And then it has an interesting construction. It doesn't have a socket. It actually has a tang, essentially, that goes into the shaft, a bit like a Zulu spear. But we have an iron wrap at the top end with a leather wrap underneath it to prevent the shaft from splitting. So you've got iron at the top end, but then you've got an even bigger amount of iron at the back end with a kind of butt spike. Now, this kind of makes it a little bit like the African equivalent to a poleaxe, because you've got spikes at both ends, you've got the ability to give blows, and frankly, it's a very, very similar size. Just put the poleaxe back there. So what you've got here is a weapon that could you use it with a shield? You actually could. It's a bit cumbersome. So it's a little bit heavy for that. I suspect that this was used as a two-handed weapon and probably liberally used with both ends in a similar way to how glaives, partisans and poleaxes were used. And it really turns around the hand very, very nicely. It's very nicely balanced, and actually the point of balance is relatively close to the head because you've got that iron wrap there and a very big head. So it balances similar to a poleaxe or a glaive. Really interesting weapon, but I'm not going to say too much more about that one because I need to do more research on it. But anyway, there we go. I think if you're looking at spears in any period, think about counterweighting them, and you don't only have to use metal's a very efficient way of counterweighting, but you can just make the shaft get fatter towards the back end. And actually I mentioned the Zulu spear, and in fact this is not a good example because it's quite tapered at the end, but some of them do actually get fatter at the back end and they have a similar counterweighted effect to them. So it's not just swords that can be counterweighted and have the equivalent of a pommel. You can achieve that with a spear as well, and for very little money and resources it creates an incredibly effective and efficient weapon. So there we go. That is one of the popular and very effective types of spear that was used by the Sudanese in the 1880s and probably goes way back. We don't really know, but probably goes back a couple of centuries at least as a design before that. So there we go. I hope that's been interesting. I have been Matt Easton. I will of course be again on the next video, so I hope that you'll be there to watch, and thanks a lot for watching. Give us a like and I hope I'll see you back soon. Cheers folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers folks.